There's a specific kind of silence that comes after you delete someone's last words to you. It's not peaceful. It's not freeing. It sounds like the air before lightning strikes, charged with something you can't name, but your body already knows. And I want to tell you about a woman who learned what that silence really means, because her story changed how I think about anger, about closure, and about the messages we destroy when we believe we're protecting ourselves. Her name was Claire. She came to see me on a Thursday afternoon in late October, 7 years ago now. I remember because the light was already dying by 4 o'clock, and she sat in that chair across from me with her phone clutched in both hands like it was evidence at a crime scene. Which, in a way, it was about to become. I deleted it, she said, before I could even ask what brought her in. I deleted his message, and I can't get it back. Now, I've heard a lot of confessions in my career. 32 years of listening to what people carry in the dark. But there was something in her voice that day, not guilt, not quite. It was closer to horror. The kind that comes when you realize you've done something irreversible, and the universe hasn't finished showing you why it mattered. Before I tell you what happened to Claire, I need you to understand something about deletion. Not the technical act. We all know how to swipe left and tap that little trash icon. But the psychological purpose of it. When we delete a message, we're not just removing words from a screen. We're trying to erase a moment of emotional impact. We're attempting to control a narrative that's already inside us. The phone becomes a tiny battleground where we fight for dominance over how we feel. And we almost always lose. Claire had been married to David for 11 years. Not happy years, she told me. Not in the way people mean when they post anniversary photos with champagne and sunset backgrounds. But functional years. Predictable years. The kind of marriage where you stop saying I love you and start saying did you pay the electric bill and somehow convince yourself that's maturity instead of erosion. They had a daughter, Mia, 8 years old. Piano lessons on Tuesdays. Obsessed with horses she'd never ridden. The kind of kid who still believed her parents were on the same team. David worked in finance. Long hours. Longer silences when he came home. Claire worked part-time at a dental office and spent most of her energy trying to fill the spaces David had vacated in their life together. She threw herself into being the parent who showed up, the one who remembered, the one who stayed. But here's what happens in marriages like that. Someone always leaves first, even when they're still sitting at the dinner table. And David had been leaving for years. The affair wasn't a surprise when Claire found out. She told me she'd known on some cellular level, the way your body knows it's getting sick before the symptoms arrive. What surprised her was how much she didn't care, or thought she didn't care. There's a difference. She confronted him on a Sunday morning in March. Mia was at a sleepover. The house was quiet in that awful way houses get when they're waiting for something to shatter. David didn't deny it, didn't apologize, not really. He said he'd been unhappy for years. He said he tried. He said a lot of things that sounded like reasons, but were really just exits he'd already mapped out in his mind. I want a divorce, Claire said. And she meant it. Or she thought she did. What she actually wanted was for him to fight for her. To say no. To prove that 11 years and a daughter and a mortgage and all those accumulated Tuesdays meant something worth salvaging. But David just nodded. He looked almost relieved. Have you ever seen someone you love look relieved to lose you? It does something to your nervous system. Creates a wound that doesn't bleed, but doesn't heal either. They separated in April. David moved into an apartment across town, close enough to co-parent, far enough to pretend he'd escaped. The divorce proceedings were civil, which Claire hated more than if they'd been vicious. She wanted evidence of impact. Instead, she got mediation and splitting assets, and David's new girlfriend waiting in the car during custody exchanges. The messages started about 6 weeks after he moved out. Nothing dramatic at first. Logistical texts about Mia's schedule. Then longer ones, late at night. David saying he missed parts of their life. Saying he'd made mistakes. Never saying he wanted to come back, but saying enough to keep a door open that Claire didn't know whether to walk through or slam shut. Her anger lived in her jaw. I could see it when she talked, the way she clenched her teeth between sentences, like her body was trying to contain something that kept trying to escape. Anger is often grief wearing armor. And Claire was grieving a marriage she'd already mourned, grieving the version of herself that had believed in it, grieving the future she'd built in her mind for Mia, the intact family, the intact illusion. Then came the night of August 14th. Claire was at home. Mia was with David for the week. The house felt too big and too empty, the way spaces do when they're built for three but only hold one. She'd had 2 glasses of wine, which for her meant tipsy enough to text things she'd regret. David's message came in at 10:47 p.m. She told me she stared at it for a full minute before opening it. Her hands were shaking. She said she knew, somehow knew, that whatever was in that message would change something. The body always knows before the mind catches up. It was long. 3 paragraphs. She read it twice. He said he'd been thinking about them. About the good years, before things got hard. He said he'd been seeing someone, the girlfriend Claire had been trying not to picture, but that it wasn't serious. He said he'd been in therapy, working on himself. He said he'd realized how much of their problems had been his fault, his avoidance, his cowardice. He said he didn't know if it was too late, but he wanted to talk. Really talk. About what it would take to try again. And then at the end, I still love you, Claire. I don't think I ever stopped. She read those words and felt something crack open in her chest. Not relief. Not joy. Something closer to rage. Because where was this 6 months ago? Where was this honesty when she was begging him to try counseling, to talk to her, to see her? Where was this vulnerability when she was drowning in the silence of their marriage and he was checking out, piece by piece, into someone else's bed? The anger rose up like a fever. She could feel it in her throat, behind her eyes, in the trembling of her fingers as she held the phone. And she thought, I don't want this. I don't want his regret or his therapy insights or his sudden realization that I mattered. I don't want to be the woman who takes him back because he finally decided I was worth the effort. So she deleted it, swiped left, tapped delete, watched it disappear. And immediately, her body went cold. It's strange, the way we can do something in anger and feel the regret before the action is even complete. Like your nervous system is trying to warn you, but your emotions are driving too fast to hear. She sat there for 20 minutes, staring at the empty space where his words had been. Tried to remember exactly what he'd said. The phrasing. The tone. But memory is terrible at precision when emotion is involved. All she could recall was the feeling, the crack in her chest, the rage, the vertigo of almost believing him. She told herself it didn't matter, that she'd made her choice, that deleting his message was the same as saying no, and she was allowed to say no. But somewhere deep in her mind, a small voice asked, what if you needed those words later? What if you needed proof of what he said? What if this moment was more important than you know? She pushed the thought away, poured another glass of wine, went to bed. The police called her at 6:15 the next morning. There's a tone that police officers use when they're about to deliver news that will change your life. It's careful, almost gentle, like they're lowering something fragile into your hands and hoping you don't drop it. The officer on the phone said her name. Is this Claire Mitchell? And she knew. Not the details. But she knew that something terrible had happened and that her life was splitting into before and after. David had been in an accident. Single-car collision on Route 9, sometime around 11:30 the night before. He'd lost control on a curve. Died on impact. The words came through the phone, but didn't land. They hovered in the air of her bedroom, like particles she couldn't quite breathe in. She heard herself asking questions. Where, how, was he alone? But her voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's body. Mia, her daughter, 8 years old, asleep in David's apartment when it happened. A neighbor had stayed with her until David's sister could come. Mia didn't know yet. Claire would have to tell her. The officer was saying something about next steps, about identifying the body, about personal effects. And then, we found his phone at the scene. We'll need to go through it as part of the investigation, standard procedure. But we wanted to let you know that you were the last person he texted. The floor dropped out. What? Claire's voice cracked. His last outgoing message was to you. Sent at 10:47 last night. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't speak. The officer was still talking, but the words turned into static. All she could think was, I deleted it. His last message. His last words to me. And I deleted them. When she hung up, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at her phone. Opened the messaging app. Scrolled to David's name. Looked at the empty space where his final message should have been. What had he said? She tried to reconstruct it. Something about still loving her. Something about trying again. But the exact words were gone, dissolved into the fog of her anger and whine and the protective amnesia that happens when we destroy things we're not ready to face. And now he was dead. And those words, whatever they were, whatever they meant, were the last thing he'd wanted to say to her. And she'd erase them. The guilt hit like a truck. Let me explain something about guilt and grief, because they're often confused, but they operate very differently in the mind. Grief is the brain's response to loss, a necessary, painful process of updating your internal model of the world to match a reality you didn't choose. Guilt is different. Guilt is the mind's attempt to maintain control by assigning responsibility. If I'm guilty, the logic goes, then I had power. And if I had power, maybe I can prevent this kind of pain in the future. But Claire's guilt wasn't rational. She didn't cause David's death. She didn't make him get in the car, didn't make him take that curve too fast, didn't control the physics of metal and momentum. And yet, her mind was trying to draw a line between deleting his message and his death, as if the two were cosmically connected. As if her anger had reached through the universe and punished her with the worst possible timing. The funeral was 4 days later. Claire moved through it like a ghost. Made arrangements. Held Mia while she sobbed. Accepted condolences from people who had no idea that Claire and David were divorcing, who called her his widow like she'd earned that title through devotion instead of legal technicality. David's girlfriend showed up. Stood in the back. Cried quietly. Claire watched her and felt nothing. Not anger, not vindication. Just a hollow recognition that this woman had lost him too, and that none of them had really had him, not in the end. At the reception, David's mother pulled Claire aside. Gave her a small box. The police released his personal items. I thought you should have his phone. In case there's anything, I don't know. Anything you need. Claire took the box home. Set it on her kitchen table. Stared at it for 3 hours. When she finally opened it and powered on David's phone, her hands were shaking so hard she almost dropped it. The screen lit up. No passcode. He'd changed that during the separation, made it simple. Like he had nothing left to hide. She opened his messages. Scrolled to her name. And there it was. The message. Still sitting in his sent folder, untouched. Because deletion only happens on one end. The sender's copy remains. She read it. And this time, she read it with the weight of his death on every word. He'd said he loved her. But he'd also said he was scared. That he'd been running from himself, from his failures, from the man he'd become. That therapy had shown him patterns he'd been repeating since childhood. The leaving, the hiding, the sabotaging of anything that asked him to be vulnerable. He said he didn't know if she'd ever forgive him. That he wouldn't blame her if she didn't. But that he wanted her to know he saw her now, really saw her, in a way he hadn't been able to before. And then at the very end, if you don't want to try again, I understand. I just needed you to know that you deserved better than what I gave you. And Mia deserves to see what love looks like when it's not hiding. I'm going to be that person, whether we're together or not. Starting now. Claire read it 7 times. And each time, she felt something different. Anger that it had taken him this long. Grief that he'd finally figured it out. Regret that she'd never get to ask what he meant. And underneath it all, a terrible, aching relief that his last words to her hadn't been cruel or careless. They'd been real. But she'd deleted them. And in that moment of anger, she told herself she didn't want his truth. She denied him the chance to be seen, just as he'd denied her for years. She came to see me 2 weeks after the funeral. She'd barely slept, kept replaying that night in her mind, kept imagining alternate versions where she didn't delete the message, where she responded, where she said yes or no or asked him to call. Her mind was torturing her with the illusion of control, as if any of her choices could have changed the fact of a car, a curve, a moment of impact. "I killed him," she said in our first session. "I know that sounds insane, but I deleted his message, and then he died. Like the universe was punishing me." "Do you really believe that?" I asked. She looked at me with eyes that hadn't stopped crying for weeks. "I don't know what I believe anymore. I just know that I had his last words, and I threw them away." Healing from traumatic coincidence is one of the most complex processes I've ever witnessed. Because the mind wants cause and effect. It wants the story to make sense. And when two unrelated events happen in close proximity, especially when one is an action we took and the other is a catastrophe, our brains will draw connections that don't exist, just to make the chaos feel manageable. I worked with Claire for 2 years, and in that time, we had to untangle every thread of her guilt, her grief, and her understanding of what she'd actually done that night. The first thing we addressed was the magical thinking. That's what psychologists call it, when we believe our thoughts or actions can influence events beyond the scope of physical causality. Claire didn't make David crash. Her anger didn't reach through the phone and cause an accident. Deleting his message didn't send a cosmic signal that ended his life. These were separate events that happened to occur on the same night, and the human mind's pattern-seeking nature was trying to link them. But understanding that intellectually didn't stop her from feeling responsible. Because guilt isn't logical. It's a defense mechanism. A way of saying, if I was at fault, then the world isn't random. If I was at fault, then I can prevent future pain by being better, doing better, controlling more. The second thing we had to address was what Claire had actually done. She'd set a boundary. This is important. When she deleted David's message, she was saying no to a conversation she wasn't ready to have. She was protecting herself from hope that might be false, from vulnerability that might be weaponized, from a reconciliation that might collapse under the weight of their history. That was a legitimate choice, an act of self-preservation. But because David died, that boundary became frozen in time. She never got to test it, never got to see if she would have softened, reconsidered, responded differently in the morning. The deletion became permanent in a way she never intended, and now she couldn't separate the act of protecting herself from the act of losing him. I asked her once, if David hadn't died, if he'd woken up the next morning and texted you again, what would you have done? She thought about it for a long time. "I don't know," she said finally. "Maybe I would have been angry. Maybe I would have told him it was too late. But maybe after a few days, I would have been ready to hear him." "So the deletion wasn't final for you," I said. "It was a pause." She started crying, but I didn't get to tell him that. And there it was, the real grief underneath the guilt. Not that she'd deleted his message, but that she'd never get the chance to change her mind, never get to have the conversation that might have followed, never get to decide, with time and clarity, what his words meant and what she wanted to do with them. Over time, we worked on separating what she could have controlled from what she couldn't. She could control her response to his message, and she did, by choosing not to engage in that moment. She couldn't control his decision to drive that night, couldn't control the road, the weather, the split-second moment when his car left the pavement. But here's what took the longest to process: the question of whether she'd robbed him of something by deleting his message. Because that's what haunted her most. The idea that David had sent her his truth, maybe the most honest thing he'd said in years, and she'd rejected it. That he died thinking she didn't want to hear it. That she denied him the closure or hope or whatever he'd been seeking when he reached out. I asked her to consider another possibility. What if, I said, he didn't need you to keep his message? What if sending it was the point? She looked at me, confused. Sometimes, I continued, we send messages because we need to say something, not because we need a particular response. We need to speak our truth out loud, or in this case, into the world, because holding it inside is unbearable. David told you he loved you. He told you he saw his mistakes. He told you he wanted to be better. And he said all of that before he died. Whether you kept his message or deleted it, whether you responded or didn't, none of that changes the fact that he said it, that he meant it, that he gave himself permission to be vulnerable in his last hours. Claire cried for a long time after that session. But it was a different kind of crying. Less frantic. More like release. The truth is, we can't know what David was thinking after he sent that message. Maybe he was relieved. Maybe he was anxious, waiting for a response. Maybe he was at peace, having said what he needed to say. But Claire's deletion didn't reach backward in time and erase his intention. It didn't make his words less real or less meaningful. What it did do was protect her. And she had to learn to forgive herself for needing protection. Over those 2 years, Claire also had to grieve the marriage that actually existed, not the one she'd hoped for. She had to mourn the version of David who never learned to communicate, who hurt her through absence and avoidance, who left her lonely even when he was sitting next to her. That David was real too. And his final message, beautiful as it was, didn't erase 11 years of pain. She also had to reckon with the fact that she'd been angry at him. And that anger was justified. The timing was cruel. Yes. But the anger itself was earned. I see this a lot with sudden loss. People feel guilty for any negative emotion they had toward the deceased, as if death sanctifies someone and makes their flaws disappear. But David was still the man who had an affair. Still the man who chose to leave. Still the man who stayed silent for years while Claire begged him to let her in. His death was tragic, but it didn't make those truths less real. Grief is complicated. It can hold love and anger simultaneously. It can mourn what was lost and what was never there to begin with. Claire and I talked a lot about forgiveness. Not just forgiving David, but forgiving herself. For being human. For making a choice in anger that she'd second-guess for years. For surviving when he didn't. For moving forward with Mia when David couldn't. And slowly, over months and then years, she started to build a new relationship with that night. Not one where she was guilty, but one where she was powerless. And powerlessness, as uncomfortable as it is often the truth. She couldn't have saved him. She couldn't have predicted what would happen. All she could do was respond to his message from where she was at that moment. Angry, hurt, scared of being hurt again. And she did. She protected herself. And David made his own choices that night, for reasons she'll never fully understand. The last time Claire came to see me, about 3 years after David's death, she told me something I've never forgotten. I still think about that message, she said, but not the way I used to. I don't torture myself with it anymore. I'm grateful it existed, that he said those things, that in his last hours, he was trying to be better. Even if I never responded, even if I'll never know what could have happened, I'm grateful he tried. She paused. And I'm grateful I protected myself that night. Because I deserve to protect myself. Even if the timing was horrible. Even if I wish I'd known. I was doing the best I could. That's the lesson I want you to take from Claire's story. Not that you should never delete a message. Not that you should always respond. Not that anger is wrong or that boundaries are dangerous. The lesson is this. You cannot live your life in preparation for tragedy. You cannot make every decision based on the fear that someone might die and your last words or actions will be frozen in time. You have to protect yourself. You have to set boundaries. You have to say no when you're not ready to say yes. And sometimes the timing will be cruel. Sometimes you won't get a chance to explain or revise or change your mind. But that doesn't mean you did something wrong. Claire didn't kill David. She didn't erase his humanity by deleting his message. She didn't rob him of peace or closure or love. She was a woman navigating her own pain, trying to survive a marriage that had already ended, protecting herself from hope that might have been false. And David, complicated, flawed David, sent her a message that mattered. It mattered to him when he wrote it. And it still matters now, years later, because Claire has chosen to let it mean something. Not as evidence of what could have been, but as proof that he was trying. That growth was happening, even if it came too late. That love existed even in the ruins. If you're watching this and you've ever deleted a message you regret, or said something in anger before someone died, or made a choice that timing turned into a permanent statement, I want you to hear this. You are not responsible for coincidence. You are not guilty of being human. You cannot live your life as if every moment might be someone's last, because that kind of hypervigilance will destroy you. What you can do is this: be honest about where you are. Set boundaries when you need them. Speak your truth when you're ready. Forgive yourself for the moments when you weren't ready, when you were angry, when you were protecting yourself from more pain. And if someone dies before you get to say what you wish you'd said, you can say it anyway. You can write it down. You can speak it out loud. You can hold it in your heart and know that love doesn't require a response to be real. Claire learned to carry both truths, that she deleted David's last message, and that she was still worthy of grace. That he died, and that she's allowed to keep living. That their story ended in tragedy. But that doesn't mean every choice she made was wrong. She's remarried now, to someone gentle and present. Someone who shows up. Mia's 16. Thriving. Still loves horses. Knows her father died when she was 8. Knows he loved her. Knows that love and loss can coexist without one erasing the other. And sometimes, Claire tells me, she thinks about that message. The one she deleted and then found again. And she's grateful. Not for the timing. Not for the pain. But for the fact that David tried. That he reached out. That his last words to her weren't silence. Because silence is what haunts us. Not the words we delete, but the words that were never said at all. So say what matters. Set your boundaries. Protect your heart. And forgive yourself for being human in a world that doesn't pause long enough to let us get it right. Thank you for listening to Claire's story. Thank you for being here. Tell me in the comments, have you ever deleted a message you wished you could get back? Or are you holding on to words from someone who's gone? I'd love to hear your story. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Take care of yourselves. And remember, you're allowed to protect yourself, even when the timing is terrible. Until next time.